Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Million Dollar Baby. So, honestly, I just wanted to watch like a fight movie or a fighter movie or like something in that realm. But then eventually, the more and more I sort of look at it, I'm like, well, how many like female like fighting movies is there really? And then eventually, once I was starting to search, I was like, you know what, this is taking way too long. And then so I was like, well, how about I just go and watch Million Dollar Baby because I've never seen this film. And plus, also, like, I like Morgan Freeman, I like Clint Eastwood, I like Hilary Swank. Let's check this thing out. And so, one thing that I have to say is, like, I rarely like boxing films. Like, I think a lot of people just have to like Rocky because it's Rocky. And like for me, I actually like the Jake Gyllenhaal movie Southpaw. I actually like that film, and it's very rare for me to actually enjoy and or like boxing films because they all feel like all the same, where they focus way too much on like the ring story, where like anything out of it is to not really matter, or I don't really care that much and I'm not really invested in the fighter to win this at the end of it because it he doesn't have a good enough story. And I've even seen that like Mark Wahlberg boxer movie called The Fighter, and I'm like, I'm just not interested in this character. Like it, like I can't figure out to just like be won over by that story. So, but going into this, like I was really just like, God, this movie is such a good boxing film, but it's so freaking sad. There were so many parts like towards the end, especially when we get to the last 40 minutes of this film, and I'm like, how are they gonna go on like with 40 minutes of this film left? And then you're just seeing them go on in this film, and I'm like, oh my god, this is so goddamn sad. To where there was at points in this movie where I'm like, don't cry, freaking don't, do not cry, like a little wimpy, like a little, don't do it, because I was just like, God, do not freaking cry at any part of this film, because that's like there was these fun moments, but then there was also like this stuff is getting freaking sad. Like they tried to do some jokes. They tried to have like Jay Barchel's character, or I hope I'm saying that right, who ends up playing this guy named Danger, who ends up kind of like bringing in like comic relief when they don't have it somewhere. And but yeah, so and plus also we have like both uh, Frankie, who's Clint Eastwood's character, and Eddie, who is to be Morgan Freeman's character, that are kind of consistently playing off one another, and how we really consistently get to see possibly how poor these characters are. Where like we have a moment where Eddie is just going and slapping these feet upon Clint's desk, and Clint's looking at Morgan Freeman's feet is like, hey, like you have some pretty decent socks in those, or holes in those socks. And they go on this whole thing about like holes in his socks. And I'm just like, man, like, and I'm interested. I'm riveted. I'm just seeing where eventually this whole thing is to play out, where they're basically arguing back and forth simply about holes in socks. But I'm just like, I'm there. Like, I'm like, okay, like, let's kind of see where eventually this is to finish up. And it's like funny where like Frankie is just like, well, hey, if I give you more money, well, eventually you buy brand new socks. And Eddie's just like, well, like, yeah, if you probably gave me more money, like I might go and pay for new socks, but I don't know, maybe I might have to be a little bit tighter with my money. It's like, so it goes nowhere. The whole sock hole debate goes nowhere. But like we also have uh where Frank is to have these moments, of course, with Maggie, and like there is this whole like back and forth thing between them, which I just thoroughly enjoy. And eventually, like, Frank is just to be the guy that's like, don't help her, don't even look at her, don't even, like, don't give her charity or pity or nothing. Don't know. Don't do anything. And then all of a sudden, the more and more that we hear about Maggie or we hear her story, all of a sudden they're just like, hey, how about, could I, let me just, could I just, let me just show you just how to just stand. Let's just show you, let me just show you that. And then all of a sudden, like, eventually more and more, like, Frankie is just like, like, okay, there's something about her, I don't know what it is, but she just has this it factor. And so, like, begrudgingly. But then all of a sudden, you eventually have uh, Maggie who goes to the ring with this certain kind of uh, just thing upon her robes that is to be this kind of Celtic or like saying that is to be on the back of her robe. And we end up finding out that at the very end of the movie, what it actually was. We waited X amount of time to just hear what this thing was, and I was like, oh my god, that was so like, God, like such an emotional movie. Um, but yeah, but it was like, anyway, transitional word. But it was good. I enjoyed it. People could probably cry, and that's okay. People could probably not like this movie because it's a freaking sad story, and I can understand that. But man, just the way eventually Maggie eventually finally hits us, like that whole moment where she's to have her birthday and she's spending her birthday in the gym, just put it, and like that one moment is probably the best moment in this entire movie. You just finally see this girl who, like, we get little snippets of what she's kind of doing, and like how she's basically this like this starving fighter, and then eventually she hits us with this whole thing of dialogue right on her birthday where she's got nothing, and she starts rattling off everything that is to have gone on with her family, and it's just like, oh my god, like this is the scene, this is the one scene where you're going to invest in this character and eventually wait to see how this all plays out. And yeah, I just thought this was a really interesting movie. I liked it, but it's sad. So I would say that, like, it's a great movie. I have to say it's a great film, but it's freaking sad. It's like, it's great, but you're gonna just be like, man, just like Maggie's family and all that's like, that was the one thing that I hated about this movie, was just the whole like Maggie's family part, where eventually Maggie is to just do so many things with this or for this family, I mean, and how they just go out of their way to just like be ungrateful, and also just eventually just are desperately trying to like steal from this woman, like basically steal from her grave kind of thing, like towards the end of the film, um when eventually they're just like, hey, just like sign all these papers, figure out how to sign them, like go ahead and whatever, because like we're gonna like power of attorney take everything from you. And I'm just like, oh my god, what a horrible people that have just been nothing but just ungrateful, whatever, freaking people. uh mm. So anyways, uh going into this, let's go out of our way to say it's about that customary time yet again to go into spoilers. There might not be a huge chunk of dialogue details that I'm going to go heftily in. That's pretty much bound to say that anyways, because this movie is quite a few hours. It's like 2.5 hours. So I was just like, okay, there's probably going to be some, like, me kind of talking about this movie in the quickest way possible. And there's going to be probably like most of this movie is all the fights that she had to be involved in. I'm like, wow, like, uh, but here's the thing also, Frankie is just this guy who is to consistently not want to have his fighter go and get a belt, be a champion of something, even if it's something as small as like, hey, like just some kind of belt because nobody else wants to fight this person. How about we just make them the champion? Might as well. And Frank is like, nah, we we just need a couple more bouts in her or in him or whatever. And so, anyways, with that said, let's go into that double five. Let's go into this thing called spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, in the early stage of this film, we have Frankie, who is to have this boxer who is named Big Willie Little. Big Willie Little. I'm so confused and I'm so just that like I heard Willie in the movie, and also we have Mike Coulter, I believe is how do you pronounce that? Um, Luke freaking Cage is in this movie. The guy who eventually was on Netflix as Luke Cage, but also like he ended up doing a number of other kind of things after that. But like it was kind of really cool to see him here in this movie, and I was like, heck yeah! Like, hopefully Big Willie is gonna freaking go and be a champion. Like I hope he is. So, uh, so what ends up happening in the beginning of this movie? So Mike is now to be managing Big Willie, and it seems that Big Willie ends up going and fighting and winning his match. And so all of a sudden everybody's kind of having buzz about Willie, and they're like, "Hey, like he should be a contender for the championship bout." And really, Willie is just like, "Well, maybe it's about time, right?" And Frankie is just like, nah, like I think we just need 2 to 3 more bouts, like, and then eventually we'll go for the belt. And eventually what ends up happening is Willie is just like, okay, all right, sure. But then all of a sudden we end up finding out really that just Willie just goes off and just decides to go on and seek another manager and leaves Frankie stranded to just go off and go for the belt and try to win it. While that's going on, Maggie is to have also gone to this event and evidently had won her fight. And so Maggie is just like, hey, Frankie, like, I was wondering if I can like train with you because like I just won my bout, but like, hey, I'm just kind of like a rusty rookie, whatever. Like, you want to train me? And so Frankie is just like, I don't think so. Like it seemed that Maggie had gotten training, but like it probably wasn't good enough training, or really just wasn't like it was just subpar, whatever, like hook or crook person that took her on to train her probably didn't do a good enough job. And Frankie is just consistently telling Maggie, it's like, well, hey, there are specific female coaches or specific people that can coach females, and Frankie just does not want to be a part of this. He doesn't want to train Maggie. And so like Maggie is to just be like, well, like but I'm tough. Like I think I can make it. I think I can, like, whatever you throw at me, I'll do. And Frankie's just like, well, girly tough isn't enough. Like you're just not gonna make it. And so well, then all of a sudden, this stubborn woman decides that she's gonna go into Frankie's gym and like put out like 6 months worth of dues so she can be in here for 6 months. So that way, they'll definitely not just decide to just throw her out on the first day out. So, but here's the thing. So, Maggie is to go on and like pay these dues, but she's to also be this waitress at this diner who she ends up going and finding some meal that isn't finished, and she ends up popping out this tinfoil and taking parts of these meals and putting it in this tinfoil. And so Maggie just sees her manager who's kind of looking over, and Maggie's to mention like, "Oh, I have a dog at home," but we really end up finding out that she's taking like these meals and going and like eating little bits and pieces of it herself so that way she can have something to eat because she's that poor. And pretty much all these people are that poor when they go to this gym. Like supposedly Danger doesn't even have fees to be able to like go and do like this whole like being trained or whatever. So Maggie is just going and hitting this heavy bag, and she's doing that from like sun up to sundown. Whenever she's not working, she's just pounding away at this heavy bag. And so Eddie, who's Morgan Freeman's character, is to tell like Frankie, it's like, you know what, like if she hits that any harder, she's probably gonna break her wrist. Like if anything, we should probably go out there and kind of like tell her like she's not gonna make it. Like she's not gonna make the cut kind of thing. So eventually Frankie is training Willie and then calling it a day with Willie. And so Frankie just finally goes and is to kind of tell Eddie, it's like, hey, do not go over there and pity her or help her or anything. Don't show her a thing or two. Do nothing. Like, we are going to just take this girl on and just have her just hit that heavy bag until her heart's content. But then we're just going to, like, just have her be here and then have her just, like, eventually just realize that she's never going to get trained, and like eventually her dues will eventually just finish up, and we'll be done with her because eventually she'll realize that she's never going to go anywhere being here. So eventually Frankie is to finally turn to this girl and to really just tell her, it's like, how old are you? And she's like, well, I'm gonna be 31 soon. And so Frankie's like, 31? That's too old. Because if anything, it's going to take you 4 to 5 years to get really good at boxing. And by the time that you're going to be really good at boxing, you're going to be no good to me. And so you're better off just eventually finding some way to eventually just get trained by someone else who does like boxing for girls, and then go off with them, and I just never see your face anymore. But Maggie's like, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to continue to, like, it gets to the point where Frankie just insults this girl so much so that she almost ends up crying, and Frankie's like, you're not going to cry, are you? Because what ends up happening is, and the reason why that whole argument starts off is Maggie continues to hit this heavy bag day in, day out, every like just punching away, just trying to eventually come up with something. And we also have like Danger Barch This guy used to mention that he wants to go and fight the world champion, and that he is gonna he wants to take on all comers and he's ready for a fight, but it doesn't really seem like he has had one lick of any kind of practice whatsoever. Like that's where a lot of like guys who will eventually like coach wrestling people, and eventually the wrestling people will just say like, "Hey, I'm just waiting for my call up to the pros," and it's like it doesn't work that way. And to where a lot of people are just honestly just naive that they're to be that good. And that's when a lot of people who are actually really good never go and seek out their dreams or whatever, because a lot of times people are just going to think like, dude, there's no way I'm going to be any good at this. And then they find out they are, and they're like, wow, like I guess I never realized it because I just didn't think that I was ever good enough. But we have also the opposite end of spectrum where people are to go on to American Idol and they sound like nails on the chalkboard, and they thought that they were the next Whitney Houston or something, and it just doesn't quite make sense. But these people are just to go off and do this anyways, I guess maybe to get their 15 minutes or whatever. Maybe they just really believed that they were really that good. But whatever. Anyways, not to say if I were to step in a ring, like I could just say, "Oh yeah, I think I can be." Like no, that's why I would never step in a ring of any kind, because I knew that I would get freaking the wind get knocked out of me, or freaking I would get taken out. Definitely. Within like one punch, I'd be like, "I'm dead." Garner me out. Call the 911s. Ambulance. Haul me out. I'm dead. You killed me with one fist in the face. So, jokes are to be had this day. Anyways, uh, so going on. So, eventually, like, we have Eddie who's locking things up for the night, like turning all the lights off, and he just consistently hears the puh, puh, puh of frickin' Maggie just still going. And Eddie's like, are you serious? Like, this woman is still, like, is she just gonna be here, like, every waking moment? Just puh, puh, puh. And so Eddie is just like, oh my god, I'm gonna feel sorry for her. And so because we end up finding out that Eddie Scrap Iron Duprice, or Dupris? I want to say Duprice. I'm probably pronouncing that. So, Eddie is to have been a former boxer himself, and he ended up boxing till he was 39, and he ended up doing X amount of bouts, like 109 bouts, and he wanted to go for one more bout and then call it a day. So, Eddie was to eventually go and show this girl how to move. How, like, basically the heavy bag is kind of working her instead of her working this heavy bag. So, Eddie is telling Maggie that she should treat this thing like a person and try to, like, consistently keep, like, her footwork and consistently trying to move and punch this thing, not just stay in one area and just continue to puh, like, just kind of move around, just kind of get your footwork. So eventually Eddie is showing her that, is telling her that, and he's also just like, well, yeah, and then next, we're going to move you on. Once you kind of get good at this, eventually we're going to get you on a speed bag. And Maggie's like, well, I don't have a speed bag, and I don't even have any kind of money for a speed bag. And so Eddie is like, well, okay, I'll just lend you one. And so all of a sudden, Eddie ends up lending Maggie a speed bag that was actually Frankie's, and so that's when Frankie ends up getting upset, because eventually, like, Maggie's starting to get good, and Frankie is like, seems like somebody was showing her a pointer or two. I wonder who that could be. I wonder who could be showing anybody what to do here. That's not me. Hmm. And so Eddie's like, like, what do you have cameras in this place? No? Well, you ain't got no proof now, do you? So Frankie is to just go over there and just tell her it's like, hey, I want my speed bag back. Give it to me. Like this is mine. And Maggie's just like, well, like then I'll eventually go and I'll buy one, and I'll just keep going to the heavy bag, and so all of a sudden, like Frankie just lays into Maggie and basically tells her that she'll never make it, or like she's never eventually going to mount to anything. And so Maggie almost starts to cry, and then Frankie is just like, "Oh my god!" Like he's just said like something awful to this woman, and so Frankie just takes pity on her, and he's just like, "You know what? Just take the speed bag. Just borrow it." And Maggie's like, "Okay, I'll just borrow it until I can get a new one." And he's just like, "Okay, fine. Like I don't care. Like I have like 2 to 3 other ones like in the back, and like just whatever. Just don't bother me. Just don't haggle me. Like, man." So, uh, so eventually, what ends up happening is Big Willie is to eventually go with this other manager that is to eventually offer Big Willie a title shot, and all of a sudden Frankie is just like, wait a minute, because Big Willie was to eventually go and like mention to Frankie about like him kind of having car troubles and wanting to like trade out like some kind of money or whatever for this car, and Frankie's like, well, I can help you out with that. And then eventually, like Willie is to kind of thank Frankie about what he did for the car, but then that's when eventually Willie lays into Frankie that it's like, dude, like everything that you taught me, like I already know. So, like that's the way, or that's the reason why I'm leaving here, is because there's nothing that I can continue to be with you and learn, because Eddie was to even tell Frankie that uh, that Willie should have gone and went for the title 2 years ago, and even Willie knew that. And but Frankie just continued to squash it. Frankie just continued to uh, just not want to have Willie go for the title. And Frankie was like, well, yeah, because I was just kind of concerned that when eventually Willie would go for the title, that eventually he would get hurt and his prime years would be like sweeping floors or something like that in this gym, because like he can no longer be able to box, whatever, or he's just going to end up getting hurt, and then like his boxing career is gone. So like Frankie was just going for smaller fights so that way Willie could continue to box, but then also just continue to keep making both Frankie and Willie money. Let me pause here for a second so I can do a reset. All right. So, uh, so now eventually we end up starting having Maggie, who is to kind of be one of the people, one of the boxers, and so all of a sudden we end up having Sherelle Berry, who's Anthony Mackie, who's so all of a sudden just kind of start to get annoyed with Danger, and he ends up calling him like Flipper or something, and so Barry is to just start to get annoyed with Danger, who's to mention that like he just wants a fight, or he just wants to be able to become the next boxing heavyweight champion of the world. And so Barry's just like, well, hey man, like come into the ring, like I'll give you a fight, like I'll go and I'll box with you. And so immediately there to like stop all that, just like, hey, no, like just like stop that, like don't even like try to egg on or whatever, and like no, don't do it. So eventually, what ends up happening is all of a sudden Barry's to all is to just see Maggie just put in a way. So Barry just goes off in his dimension, like, hey, uh like, hey, danger, like I found like a new like sparring partner or something for you. I found like a new like person for you who is this girl. And like naturally assuming that danger is a waste of time, just as I guess this girl is, and how I guess they're kind of in the same boat together weirdly, which doesn't make sense to me. And so Barry is to mention like all this crappy stuff uh Maggie, and then eventually Maggie comes and starts talking smack back about how basically Barry did so poorly on his last fight, and how he ended up like falling over because he was wanting to fall over onto a woman, and like he imagined that the mat was some woman. And so Danger was going and like dropping onto the ground and like pretending that he was Barry, like, oh hey, look, I'm Barry, I'm trying to find a woman down here. So if anything, so Barry went off and was just going and doing practice. And so eventually, the more and more, it just seems like there's no real contender here. And it doesn't seem that Frankie can easily just find another Willie. So they're just like, well, seems honestly like the only promising person is to be Maggie. So, like, everybody else is just kind of training just to train. So, Frankie finally goes to Maggie because Maggie is to have her 32nd birthday, and she is to mention like everything that's going wrong with her life, that it seems like her family, like one of them is to be like pregnant with a kid, and like her mother's on welfare, that she's ending up like stealing welfare and stuff like that. Like all of her like family members are, I guess, trying to work the system one way or another, and it just feels like all they care about is their working the system somehow or another. And so like this girl is like pretty much broke or poor or whatever, and she's just like barely skating by. And so all of a sudden Maggie's having this huge line of dialogue just talking about everything that's going on with her life, and Frankie is just like, okay, fine, like I will. Like from all that crap that Frankie had said that Maggie will never make it, and that just drives Maggie to do this more and to find places that will eventually just take her on or have her be there, and to just have Maggie just want to do this because she just is just, I guess, so upset with the life that she had led, that has just led her to punching a heavy bag somewhere. Frankie is just like, okay, I'll train you. Like, but like, never question me. Like, whatever I tell you to do, you just do it. And so eventually, Frankie is telling Maggie how to like punch the speed bag, to just kind of like hit it and then just kind of like pat it and then kind of switch arms and do the same thing and just keep like moving and moving and moving. And it's all about movement, and it's all about kind of moving your feet. And we get this long montage of a thing where we consistently have Maggie like practicing her moving her feet consistently throughout this film, even when she's in her dining job, all that she's doing is just practicing how to move like a boxer. So eventually, we have Maggie who consistently practices every single day and also practices with a person and gets in the ring and like practices and spars with somebody. And Frankie is to tell Maggie, it's like, well, you're not breathing. Like, you're forgetting to breathe. Like, when eventually you're kind of backed into a corner, you're forgetting to breathe. And so, like, man, I've seen so many kind of like UFC kind of things or mixed martial arts kind of things. I've seen like a barrage of kind of different fighter or whatever kind of films. And like the main thing that I think a lot of people forget about is, yeah, a lot of times it's breathing. Or a lot of times, like there was to be like the Warrior movie where they were to like listen to Beethoven and box or to practice boxing because you're to eventually try to match your breathing with the music, just kind of on certain kind of beats, breathe at certain times, just kind of like have that jog in your memory, to just kind of breathe with the music, which I thought was interesting. So, or to be focused, to be much more focused, and kind of Beethoven will help you be much more focused and whichever. So eventually, more and more, the further on that eventually Maggie is to be practicing, we have Maggie that is to start asking Frankie, hey, like, when am I going to get a fight? Like, am I going to get a fight, boss? She always calls him boss. And that's a funny thing with that, where, like, Frankie tells, like, Maggie, don't call me boss. And Maggie is just like, well, when you start training me, I'll stop calling you boss. And Frankie's like, well, that's never going to happen. And then so Maggie's just like, well, then I'm going to continue to call you boss until you train me. And even once she does get trained by him, she still calls him boss. Just to be like, yeah, like, you're still going to be that guy to me. You're still going to be that guy. And so eventually Frankie is just to eventually try to get rid of this girl because he naturally assumes that this girl is just going to be just like Willie, and eventually just go off with some other guy, or Frankie is just desperately trying to get rid of this girl in all actuality. So Frankie just sees this random manager guy in his gym. And so Frankie is calling this manager over and just saying like, "Hey, like, Maggie, this guy, he'll get you your first fight. So yeah, just go with him and partner up with him, and just he'll get you a fight. And so you'll be out of my hair, and I'll just be done with you." So all of a sudden, Maggie's to have her first fight, and for Frankie, who had no interest in being this girl's manager, Frankie is going to this girl's fight and watching her fight, and he's calling things out that she's not doing. She's not putting up her left. And so he consistently tries to shout that out. And Eddie is there also, and Eddie's like, "Do you really think that she can hear what you're saying?" I say that in a Morgan Freeman voice. "Do you really think she can hear you?" Like, do you, like, from way back here? So eventually Frankie, who is to start to realize the only reason why this guy is really just being really just Maggie's manager and getting her this fight is so that way the other girl can win, because this guy is to also work with the other girl, and he's just trying to get his other girl a better record so she can go off and fight whoever champion and beat her. And so all of a sudden Frankie's realizing that, and it's like, oh no, I'm going to go down there and and eventually just try and help her out and just tell her what she's doing wrong. So Frankie goes down there and all of a sudden tells her like, "Hey, your left, get your left up." And so all of a sudden, like we have this kind of this little break where like Frankie is to just tell this guy that he's a schmuck and or whatever, and to say that this guy is not doing this right, and because it's obvious that he's trying to help out the other girl. And so this guy's like, "Yeah, what are you talking about?" And Frankie's like, "I know that's what you're doing." He's like, "Well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not." So it's like, so Maggie is just to ditch this manager of hers. And so the ref is like, "Hey, like, are you her manager or what? What's going on here?" And so Frankie's like, "Yeah, I am her manager. I'm gonna manage her." So like Frankie is gonna finally just manage this girl, which he should have done all along. And so then all of a sudden we just absurdly just have Maggie who just poo 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 and freaking this girl is down. And then it's like, okay. So all of a sudden they end up going back in the back, and Frankie is like, "Well, you know what you did wrong, right?" And Maggie's like, "What?" And he's like, "You always have to protect yourself." And Maggie's like, "Well, like, you ditching me isn't exactly protecting me." And Frank is like, "Yeah, I made a mistake, but like we're gonna be together now. Like we're gonna do this together." So eventually what ends up happening is Maggie just turns into this amazing boxer of a girl with Frankie's training, that all of a sudden she just goes and just knocks these women out uh, seemingly within the first round, or just kind of almost at the end of the first round. Because what ends up happening is Frankie just, or Maggie just starts knocking everybody out right frickin' away, and nobody wants to fight her. Like, they couldn't even get fights together because no one wants to fight her. We had Frankie who had to start paying other fight managers to fight Maggie because that's how good she was. And but that didn't work out forever. Eventually people stopped coming because they're like, "Dude, she's freaking beating everybody. Why in the F should I just go and have my person just get whooped like everyone else is?" So Frankie decides that he's like, "Well, I'll just get her into a different weight class, and then we'll see how that goes." So all of a sudden, once Maggie is to go into a different weight class, it seems like there's some slight adjustments that she has to make. That it seems like instead of like in the very beginning of the first round, it kind of takes the whole first round to go and knock somebody out. But then eventually, it seems like Maggie eventually starts decking people and all kinds of stuff. So it just gets to the point where we have that one part where like Frankie is like looking at his watch, just like, "Well, I guess we weren't here for all that long," during like one of the fights that Maggie just ends up poop 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 and freaking takes somebody out in like seconds. So uh but that's still probably like a hugely difficult, like if they had to do a montage of it or whatever, like I'm sure that was like hugely difficult to film all that stuff. Uh like even with it being like a really quick whatever thing to just chuck together, um like still I'm sure there was so much like having to do with that, where they kind of had to like change outfits, change clothes, or change whatever, uh and plus change maybe arenas to make this seem all different, or maybe just kind of put some kind of certain kind of designs on things or whatever to make these things seem different, but they probably really weren't. So going into this, so Maggie changes weight classes and is to basically just still start to just continue to beat everybody. So really it's coming down to where they're starting to get offers for belts coming up, where there's like a couple of different belts that Maggie can go for, and she's declining every single one of them, or Frankie is declining every single one of them, like there's certain kind of belts in certain kind of countries that Maggie could probably go for. And Maggie's like, hey, why not? Like, why not go for any of them? And Frankie's like, yeah, I don't think so. Like, because Frankie is to find out that the one champion uh, that is to have this championship is to fight dirty, and there's something about this woman. Like, she used to be like a prostitute, and then she ends up turning into a prize fighter. I'm like, man, what an amazing story that is. I'm like, what if we had a story like that? I would be okay with there being that kind of a story, um, where all of a sudden, like, you had a woman that just like really just was maybe into some sexual things, and then all of a sudden like changed from doing that to eventually just like turn that into being a fighter. Like, that would be a really interesting combination of a movie that I think would undeniably just have a lot of people be interested in that story, and eventually be interested to see how that plays out, because people would be interested in the fighting part, but then they'd also be in like, oh, this woman was a, like she was anyways. But like, that's also just like, what, can't it just be a normal woman whenever? Like, I'm just like throwing some spice in a movie, you know what I'm saying? Like, throw some more spice in a film. Like, do another female fighting movie. It'd be kind of cool to eventually see like an MMA kind of female fighting movie, because I don't think we see much, if any at all, of those kind of things. Like, I've seen like two Never Back Down movies, but like there isn't a female variation of Never Back Down. Like, why isn't there a female version of Never Back Down? And if there is one, I should probably go and see that. I know there's probably there's this one movie, I don't know what it's exactly called. I think it's called like Lady Blood Sport or something, or Lady Blood something, or something like that, where it's some like female MMA maybe fighting film, but I don't remember what it's called. And I think I even saw like some promos or photos or something of it today while I was kind of thumbing through stuff. But heaven forbid I actually know what the movie was called. I think it's called Lady Something. But whichever. I didn't think maybe the story was compelling enough, or I don't know if I was gonna enjoy that movie, so that's why I just went with this. So, but anyways, pushing on. So, but we end up finding out that this girl is cheating or fighting dirty, and so eventually, like, Clint Eastwood is to even mention in his narration that there is a concern about possibly anybody getting killed or dying from the way of which that this girl is boxing. I'm like, wouldn't she just end up getting like stripped of her title? Like, shouldn't she have just been barred from like fighting ever again, or lose her, like, don't they have like boxing licenses or something? Like, wouldn't they get banned from ever doing that because of how they like severely cheated so badly? But that's just me, right? Like, the way that this woman was fighting seemed more like mixed martial arts than boxing. So, like, she was like throwing in like, I think like elbows at some point. I was like, hey, this is boxing, if somebody forgot. But anyways, so, but yeah, so what ends up happening is Frankie is to eventually try and go for this heavyweight belt, and we have this like argument over like 60-40 what the spread is, and then eventually it gets to like 50-50. So eventually what happens is they go on to do this championship bout for the belt and whichever. And so what ends up happening is it seems that there is to mainly be this girl who's kind of dominating over Maggie, just because she's doing these cheap cheating tactics that really are just kind of ticking me off. But like, of course she's going to use these cheating tactics to beat anybody because she can continue to get away with it. So so Maggie is getting clocked, and oh, I forgot about the like we should talk about, like, there was to be one boxing match. Like, Big Willie in his last match, he ended up going and he, like, had his face ended up getting, like, this, like, bubble, and, like, his face was starting to bleed. And so Frankie was telling Willie that he needs to get punched so that way, like, it would stop his face from bleeding, which I thought was really interesting. And so we end up having a moment where Maggie, eventually at some part of this movie, ends up getting her nose broken while fighting. And so Frankie ends up resetting this girl's nose and then trying to push things through her nose to have her at least be able to not have blood gushing through her nose. And so Frankie was telling Maggie that she needs to knock this girl out in the next 20 to 30 seconds or her nose is going to be gushing blood again. So you need to knock this girl out and you need to knock her out now. And so she ends up knocking her out and then they end up going to the hospital afterwards. And so this girl ends up going off to get her nose checked. And Maggie is to consistently throughout this movie ask Frankie about the book that he's reading, and is to also ask Frankie if he has any family, or just kind of ask about him because she wants to get to know Frankie. Because if she's training under him, like Maggie has said so much about herself and wanted to know something about Frankie, and so evidently he's reading this like Celtic book of like these sayings and whatever that comes out to be this kind of like poetic thing of sorts, which eventually Frankie tells her what that is, and she's like, "Wow, that's really beautiful." So we end up also having this saying on the back of Maggie's robes, which eventually everybody is to start chanting that instead of actually chanting this girl's name, because it seems like there's a lot of Irish people that end up knowing what that saying is. So we end up getting to this last bout. I just kind of make sure that I kind of got little bits and details and stuff like that here. We also have these moments where eventually Eddie was to take Maggie to the one guy that Eddie had worked with in the past that was working with him on his last match, where this manager guy wanted to throw the towel in on Eddie's match because like Eddie was eventually going to lose his eye, and Eddie refused to have him do it, but the manager wanted to toss out the towel, but he didn't because Eddie told him not to. And this manager had regretted it for the rest of his life whenever he sees Eddie and just like, I should have threw that towel. I should have called it, but I didn't. So now on to this last match. But like Maggie was going to eventually get taken and to eventually get transitioned to this trainer that Eddie had worked with instead of Frankie. And so Maggie went to this guy and told him, like, I'm sorry, but I'm never going to want to bump into you again. Like, so don't accidentally try to bump into me ever again in my life, because I'm sticking with Frankie. Because, like, no one else is going to look at this girl twice except for Frankie, and so she's sticking by with him no matter what happens. So now we get to this last match. I hope that I've covered most of this movie. Let's cover this and then we'll get to the big finish, or the big seemingly finish of what is to eventually go to a downfall of things to eventually sadly happen in this film. So one last thing. So eventually Maggie is to get a pretty decent amount of money to eventually afford a house. Frankie is to mention, like, hey, like, you're just renting right now. Why don't you own a real place? Like, you should have enough money to afford a real place. And so Maggie's like, well, hey, like, I finally did what you said, Frankie, and I bought a place for my mother. for her to live in. And so Maggie goes off to see her mother and to tell her, hey, like, I bought you a home, here you go. Like, you should be as happy as a clam because now you have a home to live in. And so instead of being grateful about all this, we end up having um, Arlene or Earlene. That's a weird name. We end up having Maggie's mother, who is to basically just say that if she is to accept this house, all of a sudden she might lose her welfare or any number of things because how will she be able to have afforded this house? And Maggie's like, well, I'll pay for it. Like, I'll give you money for anything that you need. Because this girl's like, well, what if, like, my insurance just, like, no longer wants to cover my medication? And Maggie's like, I will pay for it. And so then also, we end up having her mother that is to also tell, like, Maggie that, and yeah, also, like anybody who I tell what you're doing right now, that you're a boxer, like everyone's just laughing at you. And Maggie is just like, wow, like I did this and I did this all for you. And you're just like, why did I do this? Why in God's green earth did I do this? Like this giant gesture just to hear all this blah 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 blah. All that Maggie should have heard is thank you and like this is great. But no, like it's just like, well, like what if the sky falls? What if the sky just falls on me and I'm in this house? What then? Maggie's like, I'll pay for the sky to come back onto the into the sky, so that will be resolved. Like, good grief. Ungrateful. So, so eventually we go on, and I don't know what's going on with my chair. It's like, while I'm freaking doing this, I'm just trying to get this done. But it's squeaking for whatever reason. So we end up going on here, and so this match. So Maggie is kind of getting clocked and kind of getting beaten up, but eventually she's striking back. Eventually, it seems like she's on a comeback trail to eventually win this match. She's doing really well. And then all of a sudden, we end up having, of course, this other fighter who ends up doing another cheap shot. And that cheap shot ends up going and knocking down Maggie. To all of a sudden, like, this is after the bell has sounded, and all of a sudden, like, the managers are going on and getting this chair to be out to eventually have their fighter go and sit on that so that way they can kind of coach her and tell her what's next to do. So all of a sudden the cheap shot happens, which knocks Maggie to almost accidentally go and fall onto this chair and seemingly like break her neck in a way which paralyzes her. And I'm like, oh my god. So this girl had her whole life ahead of her, was eventually going to fight for the world, or for the whatever the world heavyweight, or the world championship thing, whatever, in her weight class. Like the featherweight, I don't know what kind of weight class that was, I don't know. But anyways, so and now eventually, like, we have Maggie who's in this hospital, and so she ends up finding out the news that she is never going to be able to fight again. That she is paralyzed and she's never going to be able to, like, she's just going to just have to forcibly just lay in this bed, and that's all she could really do. And so Maggie is telling this to Eddie, and she's like, I don't know how I'm going to break the news to Frankie. that Frankie is just believing that eventually I'm going to get cured and I'm going to go back and fight again, and I can't. Like, so Eddie is just asking Maggie, it's like, well, does it hurt? Is there any pain? And Maggie's like, I don't feel any pain. And so eventually Eddie is forced to have to tell Frankie what's going on. And Frankie goes in there like, oh, all these doctors are all hacks. Like, I'm going to get you some real doctors that know a thing or two about medicine. And so Frankie eventually goes and is to like go and do like kind of wash Maggie and just kind of like clean her and everything like that. And Maggie's like, well, they have doctors for that. And Frankie is just like, well, these hacks, like, no, like, I'm going to do it. Like, I'll clean you. I'll do it. Like, eventually we get to a point where Maggie's like, hey, I'm going to propose to you. If eventually Maggie is to win her last match. And like I was just thinking that wouldn't have been a nice gesture to eventually just have Frankie and just Maggie just like have this little like just wedding and whatever in this hospital or whatever. Just like, hey, we're married now, because like that whole proposal thing, it still works. Because we have like just between these two people, just this nice this just moment. And we end up also finding out that Frankie is to have, or within the story, he's to have a daughter that evidently he is to try to mail letters to. And every day he ends up mailing them out to just get them resent back as return to sender. But then I think eventually he does get a letter back from his daughter eventually. But yeah, so Frankie goes and goes to church, if I haven't mentioned this, and he goes to church like all the time every day, and a lot of times he ends up going there just to mess with the preacher, which I'm like, okay, this is kind of seeming like Gran Torino a little bit. So but yeah, so Frankie just goes and bugs the priest about like, hey man, like, what do you mean by God? But then you're also saying like the Son and the Holy Ghost. Like, what does all that mean? Does it mean like they're all demigods or what? Like, and like you're saying that there's one God, but then there's three gods. Like, what does that all mean? And so like the priest is trying to explain it, but like Frank is just like, I don't know if I buy that kind of thing. Just to like just really get at this priest, to where the priest just gets so frustrated that this priest is just like, Frank, I know like what you're doing here. Like I know you're just giving me grief for whatever reason. Stop it. Go home and get the heck out of here. Like, just leave me alone, because I know you're just trying to get to me, and it's not happening. Until he like cusses or curses at him and whatever. But so yeah, so Frankie and Maggie are like, Frankie is just go there and to watch over her, and eventually Frankie is just to be lighthearted and just to mention like, hey, like, you know what, I really love this place, like at this hospital, because eventually Frankie is to find like this other hospital that will take care of Maggie a little bit better, and so they go on this 7-hour ambulance drive to this other hospital, and uh, and so they go to this other hospital, and so Frankie is to consistently go and kind of read this book and just kind of like just be there with Maggie. And Frankie is just like, well, you know what, like I'm sure that you're gonna get better soon. So much so that like, I don't know, I've just kind of grown accustomed to just like, even if you weren't here, like I would just stay here and just read this book because I just love it here. And so eventually, at one point, Frankie has Maggie like start to read like a certain part of this book, and so she ends up trying to read it, and she's like, I don't know what, I don't know even know what I'm saying. And so all of a sudden, Frankie is to read the passage of what that she had read, And all of a sudden it ends up going into this line of words, and she's like, wow, like that's what I read. So, anyways, so what ends up happening is slowly but surely we have this girl who is eventually starting to get infections upon her skin because she can't move her body that well. Like, she can't move her body at all. Like, basically, imagine if you were to be sleeping and you could never shift to the left or right. You can only just lay there and that's it. Like, eventually, your body would naturally just want to move, but it can't. So, uh, eventually, what ends up happening is this girl starts to get scabs upon her body. So much so that these infections or scabs or whatever, the next natural thing is for her to start losing body parts, starting to lose limbs and stuff like that. Eventually, Maggie is to lose her leg. And she's like, oh my god, like, I've lost my leg. And it's eventually just going to be that she's just gonna start losing things, sadly enough. Like, this, like, eventually her just kind of just being in this bed for so long, having to have a machine breathe or help her breathe for her. I'm like, oh my god, like, this is so sad. And so, but Frankie is trying to just say, like, well, hey, like, eventually we'll, like, get you a wheelchair so you can, like, be able to get around and stuff like that, and just be like a part of everybody and whatever. So, but yeah, but they have to, like, figure out a way how to, like, put her, like, machine together, like, or kind of like put her breathing thing together so that way she can be able to get from place to place and be able to just kind of easily go through and, like, transition from being in this bed to being in this chair. But eventually it just gets to that really sad point in this movie because Frankie is still, like, holding on to this girl, and it gets to the point where even Maggie is just like, you know what, I had a good life. Like, I've been able to have people chant my name or really just chant whatever weird, bizarre thing that you came up with to eventually just feel the crowd and just to have been uh, a person who has done all the things that I've done in this short amount of time. Like, I think I'm grateful of what I've accomplished. And we have that, like, part where Eddie is to reiterate that to Frankie too, that, like, Maggie has, like, gotten to a point where, like, she can be okay of the life that she had led, of how far she had gotten, because some people never live out their dreams. Some people just eventually never get that far, and she got there. And so, because eventually what ends up happening next is that Maggie is telling Frankie, because Maggie is to have this story of a dog that she used to have, which this is such a sad story. Uh, but Maggie is to have supposedly had a dog that was to just get around the house just by kind of scooting his butt all throughout the home because evidently he, like, lost the thing of legs. But then eventually we at some point had a family member of Maggie's come in with a shovel in hand, and we just naturally have to assume that that dog passed away after that. And so we have that story here because eventually Maggie is to finally turn to Frankie and say, like, remember that story about the dog? And Frankie is to realize that Maggie is saying that eventually she wants to be just like that dog. And Frankie is the only one to really go and help her get to that part. Frankie is like, no, like, I can't do this. Because he is having this just hard time because he's like, I just selfishly just want her to be here, um, because he really had loved her. Because eventually, at the very end of this movie, Frankie tells Maggie what that whole thing meant was my darling, my blood was the thing that he put on the back of her robes. I wasn't crying. That was an emotional thing. I just had a hickle in my chickle, if you know what I mean. I had a throat problem. Not a teary sadness problem. Just like I had a frog. It's been an hour and 10 minutes of me talking about this. Throats happen. Things happen. Whatever. You're gonna cry. You're gonna cry. But I'm trying to just get this and call it a day and wrap this up. So, anyways, so what ends up happening is, since Maggie can't get the help from Frankie, Frankie's going to the preacher having this debate about this. Maggie takes it into her own hands. Maggie, or that was a horrible metaphor. Maggie ends up doing things upon herself to make her own choice. So all of a sudden, Maggie is to bite off her tongue. I'm like, oh my god. So Maggie is to bite off her own tongue, and her tongue is bleeding out. And so they end up stitching her tongue and trying to put a bandage over the tongue so Maggie won't bite it again. And they end up like sedativing her and to try to keep her from doing that again. But here's also the thing that happens before this, when like Maggie was still a coherent person. So eventually Maggie was to be told that her parents were to go and see her, or were to come and see her. And so Maggie was like, oh great, like I can finally see my family. And because she, besides Frankie, doesn't really get to see much of people besides probably Frankie and Eddie. So like Maggie goes and like waits seemingly 2 weeks for her family to show up because she has nothing better to do, sadly. And so when her family finally decides to show up, and they show up because they have obviously, and the reason why they showed up late, like 2 weeks later than they should have, is because they decided to go to Disney World and vacation spots and did a whole world tour before coming and seeing this woman that had given them a house without an exchange of money, nothing, whatever. Just, hey, here's a house, here you go. And so these people went off and did had a good time instead of going and seeing Maggie. And then once they finally do see Maggie, the only reason why they're actually there is to just have her sign away that eventually all the money that Maggie is to have made from this boxing thing, whatever, will eventually all go to them. And so they want to, like, basically the last will and testament to basically just say that this money is going to be exchanged to them, so that way they can keep all of her money that this girl had fought and is to almost die for them to get this, which they didn't deserve it. So, and they basically just want her to figure out a way to sign this paper. And so basically they're just like, well, hey, how about we just put this pen in her mouth, and then she'll sign it via that. Like, she'll maybe sign it with an X or whichever, but she'll sign it. And I'm just like, God, that is such a cold part of the story. But, like, of course it is. It's just to have you just feel just so like, oh my God! Like, that kind of just, like, heartless moment. But also, even Maggie just being in her bed where she can't control anything, Maggie's just like, you know what? I'm not going to sign this paper. I'm not going to give you what you want. And if anything, if Maggie were to have gotten out of there, she would have basically burnt down the home of which that she had given to her mother. Because it's like, F that. Like, I shouldn't have even done that for you. Because all you're just wanting and waiting for is to eventually just how much money that you can get from me when I die. That's all that matters to you. And plus, you also like took your sweet but took his time to get here to see me when Frankie has been here since day one. A guy that should have just been like, okay, later days. Like, I guess I can't like do anything with this woman. I can't make money off of her or whatever. So maybe I should just get out of here. No, Frankie has been there since day one and consistently been there. And eventually, when these people decided to show up, Frankie was to be there and just be like, "Hey, like you guys have obviously like been into Disney World and Woody Woodpeckers and all kinds of crap. Maybe you guys should go and get a change of clothes to make it seem like you guys didn't go on a vacation before you came in here and had so much fun." So, but yeah, so what ends up happening at the very end of this movie, the saddest part of this film, is Frankie is to finally just go, like, okay, I'll give Maggie what she wants. Like, selfishly, like Frankie was just like, okay, I've been wanting to just keep her here, but it's just not the right thing anymore. So Frankie goes on to get this certain kind of concoction and is to let Maggie go. And then he ends up going out of the hospital while I guess the one doctor that was to be on call evidently went on break. And then Frankie ends up just kind of just trotting out. And so the next thing that we were to think or to see or whatever is Eddie just kind of running this gym. And there was to be this one moment where Danger was to eventually go and fight Anthony Mackie's character in the ring, while supposedly Eddie was dealing with some toilet backup. And then all of a sudden, like Eddie is to deal with this thing, and then kind of just eventually quickly try to clean this all up, to realize that Eddie was just to be distracted, so that way Anthony Mackie's character could just beat up on Danger, and to the point of leaving this guy a bloody pulp, to where he is to probably just finally decide that he's going to get the heck out of there. And so he ends up just kind of walking off, and he supposedly never comes back until the very end of this movie, where we end up just seeing Danger just going like, hey, maybe I can just go and just like continue on and eventually just make my comeback trail, and not everybody wins their first match and whatever. And we had the part where Morgan Freeman ends up going and freaking punching up freaking Anthony Mackie, and he ends up falling over. And then Morgan Freeman's like, well, I guess I did get my one last match after all. So, like, that spot was really just fun, too. But yeah, so the very end of the movie, Danger ends up coming back to eventually just continue on his training. And so eventually Eddie is to realize that it seems that Frankie is never coming back. I guess Frankie to finally just go on and live in that cabin like maybe Maggie had suggested him to do. And maybe that's just what he did, was to finally just retire and just kind of finish up his life and maybe go on to buy a Gran Torino at some point, right? I don't know. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully I covered most of this movie in a roundabout way. I'm okay, I think, with some of the, like, I don't think I covered every little bit of something. That's bound to happen. I know there's several scenes where a lot of people are like, hey, you didn't mention this, blah, 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 and a number of things. This is a very long movie. It's a 2.5 hour movie, so there's bound to be something that I forgot about. But there was also a lot of stuff that I had to backpedal and say, oh, yeah, and I forgot about this. So, whatever. Trying to get this all perfectly out. So, without a doubt, I am going to get out of here. so that way I can eventually get this video out there. So I love this. I love this movie, but it's freaking sad. I don't think I'm ever gonna watch this movie ever again because it's freaking sad. And plus, it's 2.5 hours. And even though it's good, it's great. It's a great movie, but freaking just like I don't want to freaking have the back and forth of I don't want to cry during this freaking film. It's freaking sad. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.